The triumphant cheer that echoed through the deep-sea submersible was the sound of a lifetime's quest finally fulfilled. Yet, the instant that ancient light pulsed into being, it wasn't joy that filled their hearts, but a cold, inescapable dread. They had found what they were looking for, only to realize that some truths were never meant to be awakened. Her name was Elara Vance. Dr. Elara Vance. And for as long as anyone knew her, she was chasing shadows of Atlantis. Not the fantastical, Crystal City Atlantis, no. Elara was an archaeological pragmatist, a Bronze Age specialist who believed the legend, like most legends, had a kernel of truth buried under centuries of embellishment. She wasn't looking for a lost continent, she was looking for a civilization, a significant maritime power, submerged or destroyed, that had been powerful enough to leave an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the ancient world. She spent 30 years sifting through academic dismissals and obscure texts, her office smelling of old paper and the metallic tang of sea salt from countless field seasons. They said she had a way with maps. Not just reading them, but seeing through them, past the modern contours to the ghost outlines of ancient shorelines. She'd spend hours tracing faint lines on brittle parchment under the harsh, crisp azure of a library lamp, convinced the answers were always there, just waiting for the right pair of eyes to connect the dots. Her team, a rotating crew of divers and researchers, often described her intensity as a kind of silent, sustained hum. They respected her, even when she drove them to the edge of exhaustion, pulling them across some remote stretch of the Aegean or the Mediterranean, chasing a hunch. This particular season, it was the coast of a small, largely uninhabited island off the main cluster of the Cyclades. Not Santorini, everyone always jumped to Santorini, but somewhere far less obvious. She had been drawn there by an amalgamation of things, some unusual geological formations noted in a 19th-century hydrographic survey, a local fisherman's tale about a submerged, stone path to nowhere, and a single, almost illegible line in a Byzantine monastic chronicle mentioning a great light extinguished by the sea. The early dives were unremarkable. Just more rocks, more sand, the usual detritus of millennia. But Elara was thorough. Too thorough, some of her junior researchers muttered, though never to her face. She insisted on meticulous grid searches, even when the sonar showed nothing but uniform seabed. It was painstaking, mind-numbing work. Weeks bled into months. The vivid expedition amber of the sunsets over the electric azure water started to feel like a mocking taunt. Then, the anomaly. A faint, perfectly rectangular outline in the sonar data, buried deep under meters of sediment. It was small, no more than 20 by 30 meters, but undeniably artificial. The kind of thing easy to dismiss as a geological fluke or a modern shipwreck. But Elara didn't dismiss. Not ever. Her eyes, behind the condensation of her mask, probably had that particular, almost frantic light, I imagine. No, it must have been that light. That's what they said. The excavation was slow. Underwater archaeology is always slow, a ballet of precision and patience. They used suction dredges, carefully removing layers of mud and sand. Day by day, the outline became clearer. It wasn't a ship. It was a structure. Large, precisely cut blocks of local stone, arranged with a geometric exactness that screamed human intention. This wasn't some natural cave-in. This was architecture. Bronze Age architecture, by the preliminary dating of a few ceramic shards found nearby. And it was too deep, too preserved, for any known seismic event in the region to explain its submergence. It was like finding a perfectly preserved, miniature city block, dropped into the sea. This is exactly where everything changes, isn't it? Most people misunderstand this part, I think. They imagine some grand moment, trumpets blaring, the lost city appearing. But it's never like that. It's usually just a quiet shift, a feeling in your gut that something isn't quite right with the established narrative. It's the nagging thought that the piece you just found doesn't fit the puzzle you were told you were solving. And the real work isn't finding the piece, it's admitting the puzzle might be wrong. Elara's internal monologue, I heard, became a circular thing. She kept replaying the data, the old maps, the fisherman's story. It was all there, the pieces aligning, but into a picture that didn't match the one in any textbook. She started looking at the site, this submerged block of impossible precision, and then at the coast, at the land. The land was barren, windswept. But a few kilometers inland, away from the coast, there were hints of ancient cultivation, faint terraces no one had bothered to study. And, tellingly, there was a small, isolated community, almost forgotten, living in the traditional way, their oral histories filled with tales of a great city of the sea that was swallowed not by fire, but by the trembling earth and the hungry water. Their stories were different from the Platonic Atlantis, less grand, more grounded, but resonant. They spoke of a people who mastered the sea, who built with stone and light, who traded far and wide, and then vanished. This is where Professor Julian Thorne entered the story. Elara found his name in the dusty corners of academic footnotes, a brilliant but controversial scholar from the 1970s. He'd published a few provocative papers on pre-Minoan maritime influence and then, mysteriously, almost entirely vanished from mainstream archaeology. His last known address, a crumbling cottage on a remote Scottish isle, was a testament to a life deliberately cut off. Elara flew there, a pilgrimage. The wind was relentless, the sea a cold, unforgiving blue. Thorne, she found, was a man carved from granite and sea spray, his eyes the electric azure of deep water. He listened to her, patiently, as she laid out her findings, her sonar images, her ceramic dating, her theories connecting the oral tradition to her discovery. He offered her tea, a potent brew that tasted of peat and forgotten herbs, and said nothing. For a long, silent hour, Elara just talked, her voice hoarse from excitement and the nagging doubt that always accompanied a paradigm shift. "You found it," Thorne finally said, his voice a low rumble. "Not a Bronze Age settlement, or an intriguing site. But it. Just it." Elara, she was almost vibrating with a mix of relief and terror. The core, yes. The truth behind the legend. Not the myth, but the reality. A trading empire, powerful, technologically advanced for its time, submerged in a localized event, not a continent-wide catastrophe. The details distorted, but the essence preserved in memory. Thorne leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "And what do you do with a truth that unravels more than it solves, Dr. Vance? What do you do when the lie it replaces, however comfortable, is woven into the very fabric of how we understand ourselves?" This conversation, or at least the gist of it, was recounted to me almost word for word. But I imagine Elara's side of it, her responses, were less articulate, more driven by the sheer momentum of discovery. I'm not going to pretend this resolved cleanly. Thorne didn't give her a map or a hidden journal. What he gave her was a series of precise, almost surgical questions. He didn't tell her what he found. He told her why he didn't publish everything. He had found a similar site decades earlier, further east, even more completely preserved. A port city, not just a block, with complex hydrological systems, sophisticated navigation instruments, and evidence of a writing system that predated accepted linear A and B. It was, he said, a civilization that existed on the fringes, ignored by the dominant narratives because it didn't fit the progression. It didn't fit the rise of Greece story. It complicated everything. I tried to publish, he said, the memory etched on his face like a fossil. The papers were dismissed. The funding withdrawn. The peer reviews questioned not my data, but my sanity. Then, later, when the data became undeniable, the consensus was to contain it. To frame it as an isolated anomaly. To integrate it in a way that wouldn't fundamentally challenge the established timeline, the established centers of power. He paused, his gaze drifting to the wild, azure sea outside his window. I realized they didn't want the truth, not if it meant rewriting a history they had already decided on. Not if it meant admitting that oral traditions, dismissed as peasant superstitions, held more truth than centuries of enlightened scholarship. So, I published just enough to keep the idea alive, but not enough to burn the world down. This was Elara's mentor's motivation, I gathered. Not fear, but strategic justice. He believed some truths needed to germinate slowly, or they'd be crushed. That's not quite right. He believed some truths, if revealed too abruptly, would be weaponized, or worse, simply absorbed and neutralized without true change. He acted from a deep ideology, that the knowledge itself was more important than his personal recognition, and that its careful, slow introduction was the only way it would ever genuinely change anything. Elara returned to her expedition camp, changed. The vivid amber sunsets now seemed to hold a different kind of solemn beauty. She looked at her findings with new eyes. The specific Bronze Age site she had found, it was not Atlantis in the literal sense. It was a satellite of a greater civilization, a small but vital outpost of Thorn's great city of the sea. The legend, she saw now, was a composite memory, a fragmented echo of multiple events, multiple advanced maritime peoples whose existence was too inconvenient for later, rising powers to fully acknowledge. The real Atlantis wasn't a single city, it was a network, a thalassocracy, that vanished and was deliberately obscured from historical record, its memories surviving only in distorted tales. She started writing her report. But the words felt wrong. Every sentence she had rehearsed in her head for 11 years, for 30 years, now felt like a lie. When she finally wrote it, she used different words. She published on the anomaly, the precise dating, the architectural sophistication. She even gently alluded to the oral histories. She allowed her work to be debated, dissected, incorporated into the existing frameworks. She became celebrated for pushing the boundaries of Bronze Age archaeology, for unearthing a significant, previously unknown site. But the full truth. The interconnectedness, the implied systemic suppression of a vast, forgotten civilization, the challenge to the very way we construct history. That she held back. That, she told Thorn in a letter, felt like giving a child a loaded gun. And I still don't know if she made the right choice. Maybe you felt this too. That specific, hollow ache of holding a truth that is too big, too unwieldy, too inconvenient for the world, and realizing that presenting it fully would do more harm than good, or simply be ignored. The expedition team, they never quite understood. They saw the accolades, the journal covers, the new funding for further, less controversial digs. They saw their leader as finally achieving her life's work. She would laugh. Not because it was funny. Because the alternative was worse. Because the real victory was private, a quiet burden she carried alone, a secret knowledge that resonated only with the silence of the deep. I remember her telling me once, not long after it all settled down, about a specific day on the island. The sky was that impossibly clear electric azure, the kind that makes you feel small. She was standing on a bluff, looking out over the water where her site lay hidden, and for a moment, she imagined the ancient city, not as a myth, but as it truly was, a network of amber-hued stone buildings clinging to a vibrant coastline, a hub of knowledge and trade, now just a whisper under the waves. The air tasted of salt and wild thyme, and she felt a profound, aching loneliness. The kind that comes from truly seeing something, truly knowing it, and realizing you're the only one who does, in that particular, devastating way. She kept researching, even after the main publications. Always researching. Sometimes, I think she mistook thoroughness for action, believing that if she just had one more piece of evidence, the world would listen. But the research was already complete. The silence of the archives, the cold light of the screens, it became her world. She never stopped looking, not really. She just stopped telling everyone what she saw. She kept returning to that moment, that specific conversation with Thorn, that choice. The decision to act had become irreversible, but the question of whether it was right circled endlessly, like a shark in dark water. Her office, when I saw it years later, was still filled with maps, but now many were marked with faint, almost invisible amber lines, connecting disparate points. Lines that made no sense to anyone else. On her desk, under a thick pane of glass, was a single, perfectly smooth, electric azure stone. Just a beach stone, anyone would say. But she told me it was from the foundation of the submerged structure, a piece of something that should not have been there. It sat there, silent, an anchor to a truth she had won but could not share. The last I heard, she's still out there, chasing the whisper. Still looking. Not for Atlantis, no. But for the next ripple, the next hint, that might, just might, allow the greater truth to surface, slowly, carefully, without burning everything down. The real mistake here is thinking that discovery is always about bringing something to light. Sometimes, it's about what you choose to leave in the dark, or how you carefully control its emergence. Elara's choice, as I heard it, was less about self-preservation and more about a deeply cynical understanding of how knowledge works in the world. She understood that some truths are too disruptive, too inconvenient for the structures that define our understanding of history. It's a tragic kind of wisdom, the kind you wish no one had to learn. What strikes me at this point is how often we valorize the lone truth-teller, without ever considering the sheer, soul-crushing weight of that truth when it clashes with an entire entrenched system. Elara didn't back down because she was afraid of being wrong. She backed down, or rather, strategically retreated, because she was right, and the implications of that rightness were too profound, too destabilizing, for anyone to accept without a fight that would consume her and her discovery. It makes you wonder how much truth is out there, quietly held, for similar reasons. I often think about that electric azure stone on Elara's desk. It wasn't a grand artifact, just a polished piece of the deep, a simple, vibrant thing. But it anchored the silence, didn't it? It held the weight of all those unsaid things, all those carefully chosen omissions, all those truths that cost too much to tell. It makes you wonder how many such stones are out there, sitting on someone's desk, holding a story that was earned through a lifetime of searching, only to be buried again for reasons too complex to explain. How many of us, I wonder, have our own small, smooth stones? Elara chose to carefully control the emergence of her truth, understanding its disruptive power. If you had held that electric azure stone, knowing what she knew, would you have done the same? If you're drawn to the whispers of hidden history and the profound choices made when truth clashes with the world, this is where those stories find a voice. If you know someone who carries their own quiet, electric azure stone, a truth too profound or disruptive to share, this story might just speak to their soul. Given Elara's choice, if you held a truth that could burn everything down, would you reveal it or keep it hidden? Tell me in the comments, I genuinely want to know your take. If Elara's quiet burden and the idea of truths too disruptive to tell resonated with you, the like button is waiting. If you're someone who questions the history we're told and wonders about the truths quietly held, just like Elara's stone, this channel is for you.